It's another wet and drizzly morning here in Hawaii, and I'm going to need to seek shelter or I'm going to get soaked. But before I run for cover, I'd like to talk about cover crops this morning. If y'all remember, one of my last videos was on soil prep, and I discussed using plants for growing plants as fertilizers and soil amendments. And so I thought I'd like to extend a little bit into the direction, because I'm sure some people have questions about cover crop plants. So let's start off with one of the most common cover crop plants used here in Hawaii as a living cover crop and a permanent mulch, the perennial peanut.
Right out here in my front yard, you can see where we're using the perennial peanut as a lawn. It works very well as a lawn here. It can be mown with nearly ½ an inch of the ground by mowing it that short. That tends to keep other things from growing in it because they can't take that kind of mowing. It is a legume. It fixes nitrogen. It creeps very nicely on the sides. It's also relatively easy to kill it off, but the root system is really deep. This is a very, very deep root, which is a nice thing in this climate, since the nutrients in the soil tend to flush downward fast in all this rain. And so things that have great big deep tap roots tend to pull it back up to the surface again. Here's a close-up look at the plant.
There it is right there. It looks like a regular peanut, and there's very little difference. It's a little closer to the ground, so it's more compact, shorter. Otherwise, the foliage looks the same, the flowers look the same. I have not myself found the seed down here in this soil, because I never go looking for it, but I'm told that it produces a seed down there. Some people plant this from seed. I use cuttings. It's much, much easier to plant this just from pieces of stem. Great ground cover. Should work, I'd say probably zones 9 and outward towards 11. It should be just fine. I'm not certain just how much cold it will tolerate, but y'all down there in Florida and Southern California and other tropical locations, I'm sure that you'll find a use for this plant.
This is not to be confused with the common peanut. It is not the same thing.
Right here is another one of the plants that we use here in Hawaii as a cover crop. This is Mighty Mustard, Pacific Gold. This is the plain old broadleaf type of mustard. It's a specific variety recommended as cover crop material. Seeds came from Johnny's Selected Seeds. I use this in mass plantings around here to repel nematode. It also produces a lot of tonnage of green manure, so it's a good organic soil builder. It has a nice taproot underneath. The taproots, again, are handy here for drawing up nutrients. They also make nice cores into the soil, and when you kill this plant, the core will rot, worms will follow it down, and you'll get compost and earthworm castings deep into your soil when you use it. But the main reason we love this thing here is that when you cut the plant and drop it on the surface without tilling it in, it produces chemicals that drive away the root knot nematode.
So, considering the perennial peanuts and the mustard as good cover crops here in tropical Hawaii, another excellent cover crop to use here on this island is sun hemp. Sun hemp is a really, really good, tall growing legume annual. And it fixes a lot of nitrogen. It's well adapted to tropical environments, and so I recommend trying using the sun hemp plant. But you say, but Bill, what about the rest of us where we don't live in a tropical environment? What kind of cover crops should we use? Well, most of the cover crops that you'd use in the mainland, the majority of them will actually transfer over here too. So it's not really specific, since most of these things are planted as annuals, used as annuals, and then killed for the benefit of the garden. But in the mainland, one of my favorite cover crops that would be used in the same fashion we use perennial peanut here, where you can allow the plant to spread between the crops in your garden, between your shrubbery, use it as a lawn substitute. And that would be Dutch white clover if you happen to live in the northern tier. If you're a little further south and in California, I'd use the New Zealand white clover type. Tends to work a little bit better in milder climates. So those two are really the temperate climate analog of this perennial peanut that's out here. And so if you're saying, but Bill, I can't plant perennial peanut in Minnesota, well then plant white clover. Oftentimes using the white clover in combination with other plants and cover crops can work really, really well. For instance, it's very, very common that when a farmer in the upper Midwest is sowing a crop of oats to feed his cows, that as they sow the oats, they will also sow clover and alfalfa seed beneath the oats. So after the oats have been harvested, cut off, they take off the grain for the cows, they take the straw off to use for bedding, then the clover and the alfalfa will spring up, now that it's got full sunlight after the oats are molded off the top, and begin growing. It will create a perennial cover crop in that field for the farmer's hay crop or for silage that will persist for a number of years until it begins to decline. So things like clover and alfalfa can be used this way. On the other hand, there are varieties of alfalfa that are either annual instead of perennial, or what we call non-dormant, don't go to sleep in the wintertime. In California, I found that the non-dormant alfalfa is probably the best one to use in the orchards and in the gardens as cover crops. Here in Hawaii, I found that I can use the annual alfalfa here. Perennial alfalfas don't do well. Before they get a chance to live beyond a couple of years, they ordinarily succumb to local diseases. But the annual alfalfa seems a little either more resistant or its growth rate is really fast, whatever. I can get away with using annual alfalfa. And so if the cover crop is to be used in a warm season, this is the important part, cover crops divide. If you're working with a warm season situation, well, let's say you were in Illinois, you grew a crop of early sweet corn, very good choice. If you're living in the Midwest and you grew a crop of early sweet corn that was harvested when there was still maybe a month and a half, maybe 2 months left of summer weather, plus maybe some mild fall, well, then that's a time when a person can put in a warm season cover crop. And so plants that will grow well during warm seasons as cover crops would be things like mustard works. You can use buckwheat as an outstanding plant. You can use annual alfalfa. You can use non-dormant alfalfa. You can use clover. These are all really good suggestions as far as warm season cover crops. And then let's divide and talk about the cool season cover crops. There are plants that we would plant when the garden is finished in the fall that will actually overwinter in most climates or in some climates, depending. The fava bean or the bell bean is an excellent legume that's used as a cool season cover crop in mild areas of the United States. California, for instance, it grew all winter long. You could cut it and they'd come again, cut it and it comes again. So that's an excellent choice of a cool season cover crop. For places where the weather gets really cold, the ground freezes and it snows in the wintertime, an overwintered cover crop of annual cereal rye and hairy vetch are one of the best combinations you can come up with. The annual rye has a half mile of fine root hairs on each mature plant. That's a massive amount of nice, fine organic matter in the soil. It has a chemical property when it's killed that tends to repel nematodes out of the soil. So if you're working on sandy soils that have nematode problems, you might want to consider using rye cover crops to repel them. The rye can then be mixed with the hairy vetch, which is a legume, sort of a wild pea-like plant that will climb on the stems of the rye. The rye can be allowed to grow well into the spring. It really all depends on when you're going to start putting in the vegetable garden. In most cases, you want to kill the cover crops about 2 to 3 weeks ahead of doing the planting, because if you're killing the rye and vetch by mowing it and then tilling it, you want to allow time for it to decompose in the soil so it doesn't steal nitrogen from your crops as it's breaking down. So give it some time to die. Now there are other ways you can do this. You can mow it real short and you can just simply plant into the stubble. If it's late in the year and the weather is warm, oftentimes the rye will just simply die as straw and you can use it as a no-till situation. I've planted tomatoes and other crops directly into rye in the past when I lived in the Midwest. It works. You can go through, mow it, and flame it to kill it. There's a lot of different possibilities. You can mow it over and over again until summer finally succumbs. Many of these cover crops can be cut more than one time. So, again, cool season, mild winter cover crops. I'd look at bell beans and fava beans, and I'd cut them repeatedly and lay them down into the field below. In colder climates, rye and hairy vetch are probably the best ones we have. Not into warm season cover crops. There's a whole other set of plants that we'd use if we were trying to nurse the ground when the season is warm, which of course so many of us are busy planting at that time of year and growing crops in the soil. And so if you're doing cover crops in, let's say, the Midwest in summertime, this is going to be done probably one of 3 ways. Either you had an earlier season crop that is now finished, you've harvested it, and the land is fallow, and so putting a cover crop in for the rest of the summer is going to be a number one excellent idea. Or maybe you're using a plant like, say, the Dutch white clover that will be coexisting with the existing vegetation of the garden. So that's a living mulch or a living cover crop that you could use. Another option is that you have been intensively cropping that land for a while. You're afraid the yields are going down, it's getting burned out, and so it really does need to rest. And so this is called fallowing land. At one time, farmers would just simply walk away and leave the field to grow to weeds. Well, the weeds are actually an excellent cover crop, provided they are annual weeds, not the perennial ones. Okay, that's kind of hard to keep them separated. And you're not allowing them to go to seed before you're destroying the weeds. So if you're mowing your weeds so they're not able to seed, or you're tilling them in when they're still juvenile, they can be very beneficial. Weeds tend to fix scarce nutrients. That's why they're weeds. It's probably much better that you would decide to choose a cover crop. And so plants like alfalfa really don't reach their maximum until they've been in the ground for a few years. And so alfalfa is an excellent choice to use where you have ground that is becoming degraded and you want to take it out of production for maybe 2 or 3 years' time and allow the alfalfa to grow in there and create deep tap roots, fix a lot of nitrogen. Alfalfa plants will fix about 1,500 pounds of nitrogen per acre. That's a lot. Okay, and that's a basic nutrient. That's a green power, okay, in your plants is nitrogen. So it can be used for this. You can also use the annual types of alfalfa, and they may not size up very much during the short period of time you have them in the ground, but they will do some benefit. An excellent cover crop to use during the warm season is buckwheat. buckwheat is a great nectar plant. It produces some very high-end honey. The honey is dark, looks almost molasses-like, has a distinct flavor, and sells for quite a price. So if you keep bees and you plant buckwheat, then you really have something going there. Buckwheat is also one of those unusual plants that fixes phosphorus instead of nitrogen. We're usually talking about legumes with rhizobias fixing nitrogen from the atmosphere. Well, buckwheat doesn't do that. Buckwheat enhances the phosphorus content in the soil. Now, I'm not even sure what kind of horticultural alchemy causes that to occur, but it is well known that buckwheat is a phosphorus fixer. So it's, again, another excellent crop that you can use. Now, you can sow the alfalfa that I mentioned earlier with Dutch red clover and New Zealand clover underneath. That will help keep the ground covered beneath the taller plants, which really does a good job in killing weeds off. You can also use clover underneath buckwheat. So if the buckwheat reaches the end of the season, your bees got the nectar out of it, and maybe you harvested off some seed to use for your buckwheat pancakes. And then the buckwheat would be mowed and the trash laid right to the field, let the roots die in the ground. If there was clover underneath, then the clover will keep the ground covered for the rest of the winter. And come spring, you can either decide to kill the clover and plant into bare soil, or decide to use the clover as a living mulch between your crops. So this all works out pretty handy. Another one of the excellent cover crops that a person can use in the warm season is the soybean. Now, the soybean works here in Hawaii, the soybean works in Iowa, the soybean works in Maine. You can use the soybean in all sorts of places. And a crop of soybean like the edamame, if it was planted as a cover crop in late summer, will also manage to produce a certain amount of yield, so you can get some edamame out of that stuff too. So consider using the soybean. It fixes a lot of nitrogen. It's a great green manure plant. Most of us like soybeans. Another possibility is the use of either that old vegetable seed. In other words, if you got a bunch of questionable vegetable seed that started to lose germination and so on, you can just take mixed vegetable seed and broadcast it across a garden, allow it to come up and grow, and then go ahead and just kill it. Use it as green manure. That works. Another cover crop that I've used when I'm trying to rest ground for a period of time, like with alfalfa, where the soil's depleted, is wildflower mixes. Wildflower mixes are awesome. They're the types of plants that are vital. They are able to grab scarce nutrients in soil and do a lot of magical alchemy stuff with the nutrients in the earth. The wildflowers are there basically almost as weeds, again, for the recovery of the earth. And they will drop seed, and they will probably pop up in your gardens later, and people will come by and say, "Oh, Bill, you have California poppies growing in amongst your tomatoes and bachelor buttons. I've never seen anybody growing flowers in their vegetables before." Yeah, thought that one up myself, right? Yeah, sure. That is actually how I started integrating flowers and vegetables in the same spot, was by using wildflower mixes as cover crops and having the residue just pop up randomly through my garden. And a little bit of volunteering there is pretty, it's pretty. So I highly recommend using wildflower mixes as cover crops. The ground's beautiful during the period of time that it's being rested. If you use a mix that has both annuals, biennials, and perennials, you can let it go in there for 3 or even 4 years sometimes, depending, as the different types and different stages of the plants develop. And each different stage, be it the annuals or biennials or perennials, will all have certain different contributions. Or you could just use plain annuals like bachelor buttons and Shirley poppies and stuff. Let them grow for 3 to 4 months and kill them off. But there are mixes that you can keep them going for 3 or 4 years. I once experimented with taking some rather overworked soil, planting it for 2 years into wildflower mixes, then killing the wildflower mixes, and without adding any additional fertilizers, planted tomatoes and peppers into that ground, which are not the heaviest feeding vegetable crops, and found I got decent crops of tomatoes and peppers just by the residue of the dead wildflowers. So there you have it, folks. The rain keeps getting heavier out here, and I'm just going to have to seek cover, crops or not. Looks like we're in for the rest of the weekend being pretty wet, which is good for bringing up seeds for cover crops. The only thing otherwise I could say is when planting cover crops, ordinarily we will plant them across the walk rows, the planting rows. They go everywhere, and we just kind of evenly broadcast the seed. Now there are, these whirly-bird type seed spreaders. There are drop spreaders like we use for lawns. All sorts of different possible seeding machines a person can use. When I'm doing this, I actually prefer to use a plain old 5-gallon plastic pail, and then I'll mix the seeds I'm using with compost. So I'll put in a layer of compost, a layer of seeds, compost seeds, compost seeds, compost seeds, building it up till I get about half a pail full. Then I kind of stir the stuff a little bit. That way when I go out into the garden and I begin throwing this into long arcs, I enjoy this practice. It's one of my joys in life is sowing seed. But you'll be able to see the compost layout, so you know where you've been and where you haven't been. The compost will help distribute the seeds so you don't get big clumps of stuff. It'll spread the seeds out. It also covers the seed to a certain extent. So mixing your seeds for cover crop planting with compost will make your job a lot easier. So I hope we got everything covered here. Aloha, hang loose, happy gardening.